Doug gave the first eSource presentation to the FDA in 2008, and he has a master's and bachelor's in philosophy from the University of Montana.
The first presentation to the FDA on eSource, funny story about that. Clinical Inc. started actually, Clinical Inc. is the embodiment of the vision that Dr. Tommy Littlejohn, who was a principal investigator and the CMO at PMG, Jennifer Burns Network, had for many, many years. And so Tommy and I actually went up to the FDA to give a talk on eSource. And in 2008, no one knew what eSource was. And we were expecting a meeting about the size of this. And I was signing us in, and Tommy went and peeked in the room, you know. And he came running out, and he said, "Oh my God, there's hundreds of people in there." And I said, "I'm the one giving." I said, "What?" So I peered in. It was just this gigantic room with cameras and lights, and it was awful. I was scared to death, and I get up there and I start talking, and I'm looking for someone in the crowd, a face that's like getting it. And I see this woman to my far right, and she's getting it. I mean, she's nodding and she's shaking, and I just stared at her the entire time. I'm thinking, at least one person is on me. She's like on board. I'm thinking she's probably going to come up and ask for a job. So afterwards, I'm walking by and I'm looking at this woman because she got me through the entire thing. And I noticed that she was still shaking her head. And I sat down, and poor thing, she had some sort of tic, and she shook her head the entire day. But it got me through. I needed that, and didn't feel quite as good when I figured out what was happening. I'm going to do something different, in the sense that Clinical Inc., as Nick said, we started in 2007. We came out of a sites experience, a sites burdens, and what the guiding vision is if we take care of sites and we capture the data the way we should at sites, sites are improved and CROs and sponsors are improved as well. So our focus has always been kind of coming out of a site and coming out of the experience of a site. But I'm not going to talk about our tools today. I really want to talk about innovation and what drives it, especially the kind of innovation in our world which is typically triggered by inventions, by things. So I'm going to talk about these three things: innovation versus invention. And then I know you're like me, you've been going to these meetings for years, and you always ask yourself, why don't people talk about horses and cars? Today, I'm going to talk about the transition from horses to automobiles in urban transportation. Then I'm going to bring what we learned from that massive transformation. I'm going to bring it back to bear on our world and talk about eSource and the direct data capture. So, a couple things. We tend to interchange the words innovate and invent, and they're actually quite different. So when we talk about innovation, and the word innovation literally means to breathe new life into, to renew processes that we are already doing. So when we're innovative, we're looking at what we do and we're saying, how can I do this better, whatever this is. And innovation almost always requires people, a team. Single people can't innovate, typically, okay? Now, invention literally means to uncover something new. It's a very old word and comes from the Latin. And in that day, the thought really was there was nothing new in the world. We simply had to uncover or discover new things. You didn't invent in the modern sense of literally creating something new. The world was sort of static. So an invention is a thing that we have found. Now, invention doesn't always lead to innovation. In our world, our innovations are often fueled by inventions. But there's lots of examples of great inventions that didn't lead to innovations. And one that I like to talk about, because it's dear to many of our hearts, Xerox had a research center called the Palo Alto Research Center, or PARC. And they did amazing work. They did cutting-edge work. And the company that paid for that work was typically blind to the commercial possibilities of that work. And they invented a computer that was the first computer that had a graphical user interface, that really had a mouse that worked. And it was an amazing thing. Xerox did nothing with it, zero. They didn't see it and say, wow, this could lead to an innovation of personal computing. Well, you all know this story. One day Steve Jobs is walking through here, and Steve Jobs says that and says, oh my gosh, I can imagine him running out, and he built that. He sees the invention and sees how he can innovate the personal computing experience using it. So, innovation is a product of a company's culture, not the intellectual property that they may own. It's a way of thinking about things. It's a way of looking at the processes that shape our lives and asking ourselves, how can we do that thing better? Now, we are in the midst of this incredibly broad, transformative transition from analog information, analog thinking, analog processes to digital thinking, digital processing. And I think the best example of a transition as big as this is the transition from horsepower to automobile power. So, bear with me for a few minutes while I talk about horses. And again, it's probably the only time, and maybe the last time, you'll be at a meeting in our world where someone will talk about this. But 1519, Cortez arrives in Mexico with, on board his ships, maybe the most transformative invention, if you will, that the natives had ever seen: horses. The Spaniards had armor, they had muskets, they had funny helmets, but they had horses, and that's what really shocked everybody. And when they landed there in Mexico, of course, there were no horses. You carried stuff around in your hands. If it was really heavy, you got a friend, say, hey, help me pick this up. You pushed things, you dragged things. It was unbelievable, okay? These horses came along, and the Spaniards, of course, conquered everybody that they met, and during that period, they brought horses, okay? So at the end of a very short period of time, there were very, very few native indigenous people left, but there were horses everywhere. And in a remarkable amount of time, gauchos in Bolivia and Apaches in New Mexico and colonists in Boston were all riding around on the same thing. And in fact, when we think about the Apaches, let's say, you always picture them on horseback. I mean, think how different movies would be if the Apaches came running up over a hill, or they were chasing us on foot. I mean, it just doesn't work. They're always on horseback, right? But that was not their native way of getting around. So, 1884, there are over 150,000 horses in New York City alone, and millions across the United States. 1885 was the invention of what was called the horseless carriage, automobile. Auto means it moves without a horse. It means it moves by itself. Everything else is either pulled or pushed by horses. Horsepower. We understood these early engines and early horseless carriages in terms of what's the equivalent in horsepower. So we're still thinking in horse thoughts, horse ideas, and we're trying to move away from that. So 1885. I never knew this until recently. 1899, Henry Bliss, first U.S. person to be killed by a car. He steps out of a horse-drawn carriage. There is an electric taxi coming silently, and it literally runs him over and kills him. So it's invented in 1885, kills its first person in 1899. By 1900, over 4,000 have been sold. Look at this jump here. By 1912, 365,000 are sold, and now there's more automobiles in New York City than horses. By 1915, 500,000 and up, and of course, the latest thing I saw was, essentially 250 million cars in the States now. So, a remarkable uptick It took a little while to get it going, but then once it went, boom, it was gone. Okay? And unfortunately, Henry wasn't the last guy but to suffer from this. What drives this, what drove this transition from horsepower to automobile power that might be relevant to the innovation that we're in the midst of? There are three things. The first one is a term that economists love to use, and I love it just because it's such a stupid expression: negative externalities. I'll explain it in a second. MVP, something that those of us who build things and push out and sell, is minimally viable product. What's the crappiest thing we can sell? Right? As soon as it hits version 1.0, will people buy it? Yes, that's an MVP. Get it out the door. If it's pre-MVP, no one's going to buy it. And finally, there are supportive regulations that, in fact, fueled the move from horses to automobiles. So, what's an externality? For an economist, an externality is simply a cost borne by a third party that's caused by another party. Okay, so you do something, and I, who was not involved in your choice, pay the price for it. It can be a positive price. So if you lead a really healthy lifestyle, you're using your apps, you're eating well, you're running, you're a healthy person, I enjoy a positive externality in that I don't support you when you're sick. However, if you don't use the apps, if you eat too much, drink too much, don't exercise, you're ill, and I have a negative externality. I have to pay for your health care. Now, let's talk about the negative externalities of horses. Keep in mind, there are millions of horses here. There's no negative externalities here. The negative externalities are on this end. A horse can be understood as a hay-eating, negative externality excreting animal. Okay? This led to the great manure crisis of 1894. There are over 150,000 horses in New York City. They produced 550,000 tons of manure a year. It was a serious problem. Picture that. Manure everywhere. Again, the movies have done us all a huge disservice. The movies about this era never show this, but it was horrendous. Okay? People were panicked. What are we going to do? There's literally too much manure in the cities. They would pile them up in these lots, and they would be 40, 50 feet high. They tried selling them. But what happened was there was so much that the market collapsed. The market for manure collapsed because it was cheap. So what do you do with it? No one knew. That is a city street in New York City. The stuff to the left is manure. Again, you never see this stuff. I never saw it in school. This is kind of vague. That's a street. That's manure piled up. It's unbelievable. Filthy streets, mud bogs, dead horses. 41 dead horses were disposed of every day, and countless more were just left to rot. Okay? Look at this. Look at these kids. Now, the most remarkable thing about this, and for those of you who have kids, none of those kids are like poking them or looking at them. It's clearly a common thing. My kids would have been like done there, poking it and walking on it. I mean, these kids are oblivious to this dead horse. It's sad. It's awful. But it's commonplace. Dead people. The death rate, this is crazy, the death rate for vehicular accidents, horse-drawn, far exceeded the death rates we have now from cars. New York City, people were dying by the dozens, being run down by horse-drawn things. Think about it. There's two brains involved in every horse-drawn thing, one of which is really stupid. So it's like you're in the back seat of your car trying to direct your driver, who's an idiot, through streets and who's prone to like nervous excitement and panic. Now, my wife thinks that that's what's like riding with me, and she's always trying to, but it's not. But that's what happened. Crossing sweeps. Again, we don't learn this stuff. Crossing sweeps were little poor children who sat on the corner, and when people of money came by, you'd pay them to sweep the manure off the street so the ladies wouldn't drag their dresses in the manure. This is New York City, okay? Now, 1898, the very first International Urban Planners meeting was held in New York City, scheduled for 10 days. The main topic, what do we do about all the manure in our streets? They gave up after 3 days, and they all just went home. We're doomed. We can't solve it. Can't be solved. Okay, that's crazy. Those are the negative externalities involved in horses. Now, what I want you to be thinking about is, if the negative externalities had not been so great, which they weren't until more and more and more people packed into our urban centers and brought horses, it was fine. They didn't need anything else. People didn't start driving cars because they were dissatisfied with horses. People love horses. And think about the early cars. They were awful. No one would say, yeah, I don't want trigger. I want that piece of crap car that always breaks down. No, they were forced to by the negative externalities, right? The costs were being borne by someone else. It's not my horse that I'm stepping in. It's your horse. And you're on your merry way. Negative externalities, costs, borne by other people. Now, minimally viable product. Doesn't have to be perfect or even all that good, but it has to be good enough. This is the first car Mr. Benz invented. And there's widespread dispute about if this is the first. But let's just say for the time being, that's the first. 1858, not MVP. Can't sell that thing. It's awful. By 1912, that's nice. I mean, we would drive that. I wouldn't say, are you kidding me? This, I'm not sure. That thing, absolutely. So by 1912, and even before that, they had an MVP. They had a huge pile of negative externalities, and they had an MVP. What did they lack? They lacked a regulatory environment that took advantage of the MVP and addressed the negative externalities. So, initially, there were few regulations concerning traffic in our streets. Most people walked. Some people rode bikes. Some people had horse-drawn wagons and stuff, and other people had cars. It looked like this. Now, I don't know how well you can see this, but try not to obscure you. This is a guy on the bike. They're in a little car. This guy is crossing the street in front of everybody with a horse-drawn thing. This is called an omnibus. It's a horse-drawn wagon. There's people everywhere. It's crazy. Look at this. It's hard for us to imagine this day, but no one had figured out, dual direction roads, and you go left, I go right, or one-way streets, or stop signs, or yield signs. Nothing. It was just chaos. Okay? Then they passed laws concerning constructing roads. This is what people in the early days had to put up with. Okay? They thought about maybe paving these roads. So states passed laws to aggressively pave their roads. They paid for it because the negative externalities were so high. They had an MVP, and now they needed to build laws around that to make this work. Safety standards. Okay, so these are the three things that were driving this. And I think any big, sweeping, large, transformative innovation needs all three. If there's not a high enough cost, no one's going to really care. If there's not an invention, a thing, a product that addresses those costs, you can't solve it. And if there's not a regulatory environment that supports the innovation, it's never going to work. So let's bring it back to clinical trials. The same three things are here. Now, we work in sites, lots and lots of sites. And I'm glad to hear that you've got one paper form. That's awesome. It's also extremely rare. We talk about paperless studies. We talk about paper studies versus electronic studies. And what we really mean by that is we use an EDC system or we don't. And I mean, it's very, very rare we don't use those now. So a true paper study, what we mean by that is paper source form and a paper case report form. The paper case report form has been effectively replaced by an electronic version. But guess what's still there? Before the EDC, there is still typically, in most studies, a paper source form being filled out. So let's talk about this. My claim, for the sake of this talk, is paper data capture is to clinical research what horses were to urban transportation. piles and piles and piles of negative externality at sites. I'm being as polite as I can. So there's the pile. That's a paper source form. And I'm telling you, the dirty truth to our world is that we talk about electronic studies all the time. We talk about powerful systems, but you go to research sites and that's what you find. Now, in certain studies, definitely not. You know, on ecology is one where you don't have this, but typical studies, you go there, that's what you find. Okay? It all starts there. Then, days, the US average is over 2 weeks later, yes, I want feedback back. Maybe we'll get some stars or something. Yes. So 2 weeks later, let's just say, someone sits down and they transcribe the data into the EDC system. That's the electronic part. Now, notice we made the move from analog to digital by someone actually transcribing it. Okay? I was at a site 2 weeks ago, and the investigator, who's kind of a wild guy, says, we should make EDC change their name to EDT. It's not electronic data capture, it's electronic data transcription. Okay? The capture is on paper. Okay? So this is what this person's doing. Then, because it's a regulatory data, because the source data can't leave, you send monitors to the site to compare that data. All those orange binders are piles of source forms, or I would say piles and piles of negative or externalities. Notice how she's kind of slumped. Imagine looking at all that stuff she's got to do. These binders are still there. They're not full of paper-cased report forms. They're full of other things. Okay? Now, after she leaves, she annotates the paper source form, and they go back, and now the first woman goes back and looks at it and says, oh my gosh, and starts modifying stuff. Okay? Then at the end of the study, it's piled up in boxes and it's put in a closet, and then eventually it's stored in, if you're lucky, Iron Mountain. If you're not, it's like Joe's Mountain, right down the street. But if you're lucky, it's in Iron Mountain for 14 plus years. Okay? That is the truth of clinical trials. And that is much like this. We got a car, but it's being pulled by a horse. We've got a guy sitting on the hood of the car with reins, and he is not ready to make the transition quite yet. He understands cars can help. Cars are good. But he can't quite free himself from his horse. So he shackles his poor horse. So now the horse is not dragging a cart, it's dragging a car. Now, if paper data capture is analogous to horse, that's what it is. That is a paper source form, and that is an EDC system being dragged through the clinical trials. And maybe you say, Doug, that's just not being fair. It's way better than that. Maybe you got two horses dragging it. Okay? So, what does that bring us? So what are the negative externalities that result from a decision or necessity to capture data originally on paper? 10 to 12 years and 1 billion from discovery to market. Last night, I wrote this down. It doubled over the night. David, I was shocked. It's now 2.5 billion overnight. I mean, tomorrow, Lord knows what it's going to be. 4 billion. It's a scary world. Now, this is amazing. And these numbers are not pulled out of the air, but they're kind of what we all see all the time. Somewhere around 50% of sites fail to enroll a single person. We spend all this money training the sites, finding sites. Half of them don't enroll a single person. And then the rest of the data is terrible in terms of how many enroll 1, 2, 3. 50% of investigators are one and done. Over 50. And I've seen numbers as high as 80. Okay? Most of them do one study. The process is so bad, the experience is so bad, they say, forget it. You know, I don't want to do it. 20% of a coordinator's typical day is spent transcribing data from paper to EDC. 17% or up of patients that we finally find and enroll in studies just quit. They drop out. They're so disengaged that their compliance begins to suffer. They miss a visit, they miss a second visit, and they're gone. The things that you're doing to try to engage them critical to keep people in the study. In 2013, in the United States, CRAs had an attrition rate of over 20%. Okay? There's a lot of churn. These are highly trained, qualified, well-paid people who quit. Over $10 billion a year is spent on monitoring activities. These are the negative externalities that result from a decision to continue to capture data originally on paper. Okay, we've got terrible negative externalities. We've got terrible costs. Is there a minimally viable product? Well, the first tablet, this is an Apple tablet, 1983, called the Bashful. I know why. Hideous thing. If I was, I would never go outside either. That's the whole thing. There's a keyboard over here, there's some stuff here, and there's a tablet stuck in the middle with a handle on it, okay? Now, it's not, no one's going to buy that. Apple didn't even show it to people. In 2005, we had a motion tablet. It's bigger than that. And it was, in fact, an MVP. I used one for a year. It was an amazing thing. If I pulled it out now, you would laugh at it. It's big and huge, and you're like, what is that? But I pulled that out on planes, and people would stop by and say, what is that? And I would write on, and they go, my gosh, that's amazing. So finally, by 2005, we had an MVP for tablet data capture. How about phones? 1989, not going to happen. That was cutting edge. That's the kind of stuff you put in sitcoms to make us feel like, wow, that guy is like hot. If you ever saw the show Miami Vice, the coolest people on the planet, right? The linen suits, the colors, Ferraris. Do you recall their phones? They were like that. They would get out and crack it with the phone out and have this thing he would be talking on. And we think, it just doesn't work. Okay? Now, by 2007, we've all shown it. The first generation iPhone came out, and now we have a smartphone-based invention, if you will, a thing that can fuel innovation. The negative externalities are, in fact, there. Cost is high. We've got an MVP. Now, the question is there supportive regulations to help here? When I started this in 2007, the FDA was confused about what we were doing, and that's being nice. That is not the case now. They are fully on board helping us move from analog to digital. Won't spend too much time here, but you all know in September of 2013, the FDA issued their final guidance on e-source. They use words that the FDA has hitherto never used. They said things like promote, encourage, eliminate, facilitate. They want us to be doing this. They want all of us to get rid of paper. The same year later, they issued their risk-based monitoring guidance. They're saying we've got to address the costs associated with monitoring. How can we do it? And one of the key things in that guidance is they do not care how many times you send monitors to a site. There is absolutely zero required visits. Now, we all know we can't get away with that. But what drives it is how well can the sponsor access source data? If they can access source data without going to a site, they don't need to go to the site as often. The FDA clearly sees that paper source equals greater risk. There's omitted and erroneous data. There's, of course, the transcription error, and key, there's delayed access to data. So, we got those three things. We've got serious negative externalities. We are fortunate in this day and age to have minimally viable products, and we also are fortunate to have a very, very supportive FDA and EMA regulatory environment. So just a couple things on what we do. So what we do is we have a tablet-based e-source tool. So the idea is let's just be honest, and let's admit that we're capturing data before we enter it into an EDC tool, and let's capture that data electronically. Let's move the sophistication of electronic case report forms up to source. Just move it. Because it's electronic, it can be displayed on a portal, one portal where you go to see all of your data. It's all done in the same day. We take 2 weeks and we collapse it down to minutes. So when the person leaves, you check in the form, and all the data is on the portal and shooting its way to the data management group. And this is, I'll just run through it, but this is the way it looks. You can write in your data. You can build in edit checks and validation rules. You can write your handwritten notes. You can navigate page by page or jump to, and of course it's being saved all of the time. All standard stuff. I mean, all the stuff that you would expect any kind of electronic data capture tool to do. The smartphones have made possible better engagement with patients. But the smartphone itself would never have led to the innovation if we didn't have this high negative externalities of people dropping out. Okay, we, like others, have patient engagement apps that actually show how you're doing. So this is our tasks. Okay, I'm trying to get into a green. I've only completed 33%. That's failure. I mean, that's awful. Why would I want that? Okay, run through these things, and the idea is we've spent all this money finding these folks. We can use technology to engage them first, to make them feel a part of the study, make them understand the study, reward them for compliance, and they're more likely to stick to the study. We can do things like where your clinic is. Don't forget you've got to visit Thursday at this site. Here's the map. Private diary, e-approach scales, that sort of a thing. So 2 different ways where the 3 things have allowed us to start introducing e-source technologies into the clinical trial world. Questions? Comments? If someone asks you what this talk was about, you can honestly say, it was a bunch of horse shit. You know? And I feel better giving you the chance to do that. Yes, sir.
I'm sure you've seen this as your space has progressed, and actually Eric's example made me think that, having 7 portals is nice, but I think we have a tendency as we go through this process that we take a paper or a manual process and we mimic it in an electronic format. Is that just a natural part of getting to the MVP, or can we be more innovative in leaping over that and process change and other things as well?
So one of the things that we have found is this is a fantastic way to capture data. And we've been working on this for 3,000 years, and it works. They're all sitting here. Many people are taking notes. You've never called the help desk about your legal pad. It doesn't crash. I mean, it works really, really well. So what we try to do when we first looked at this is we asked ourselves, what's the problem with this method of capturing data? Is it literally the way it looks, the way you write? No, it's not. It's the paper. The paper is the problem. Writing on things makes a lot of sense. We're very, very used to writing on things. The problem is you write on paper, and now it's like stuck. What do you do with it? So what we tried to do, and I'm not saying it's right, but what we tried to do was let's keep the style of capturing data as similar to what we all know and use every day, all the time. So we built our screens to look like a form and allow you to enter data just like a form. So if I handed you our tablet and said, here, fill this out, gave you the pen, you wouldn't say, how? You'd say, sure. You would just write on it. And you would check, you would add numbers, and you'd add handwritten notes, and it's done. So we found that to be a really useful way to start this. It reduces training, it reduces fear. Once people say, wow, this is just like what I've been doing, except it's super fast, and we take those massive piles of negative externality and we shrink them down.
There's always been this perception that source records at sites have to be there, and there's different electronic source systems that are going on. Somebody wants Epic.
Yep. everywhere. Yep.
Your system, I think, has got the ability to supplement, and do you tie into
Mhm.
those systems? How do they play together?
Yep. Well, the unfortunate answer for us and everyone else is they really don't. And the reason they don't is a really straightforward one. If there was one Epic, I mean, Epic, last time I read, over like 52% of U.S. people had their data in an Epic system. But Epic is not Epic with a capital E. Epics, they're everywhere. And they're very, very different. And they don't communicate data between them. And for us to build a bi-directional bridge with one, we can just do it. It's just a matter of, is it worth doing it? Is someone going to pay us to do it? But in a phase 2, let's say, or phase 3, it's not 1, it's 100 or 2. And now we're talking about building bi-directional data exchanges between all of these things. You have to ask, is the data that we're getting worth the cost? Now, there are some studies, maybe at phase 1, where the answer is yes. But if you look at what data has to be transcribed out of an electronic medical record at the site, and therefore has to be SDV'd, it's typically a very small set of data. There's some medical history data, there's some con-med data, there's a problem list. That's work someone has to do, and it has to be SDV'd. The cost of having a coordinator transcribe that data and a CRA SDV just that data is fractional compared to the cost it would take anybody to build 100 bi-directional data pathways. So what a lot of people see coming is individual electronic medical record systems feeding data into houses of data. And Epics become the front end. Epics become where we capture data, but it goes out here, and then systems like ours can access it. That can be done. I mean, that's not a big deal. But from a political point of view, I mean, think about that. Who's going to own that data? Who are we going to trust with literally all of our healthcare data? Google? The government? Just some guy? Me? No. So we have these kind of iron mountains. So these are really important problems for us to solve, and we're working on ways to make building those bi-directional exchanges faster and cheaper. Because clearly, no doubt about it, what we want to be at some point is one source of data, both medical data, patient care data, and research data. But we've been talking about this for a long, long time, and I think we're still a ways away from that day where medical data is just flowing around everywhere. I belong to Novant Health, and I had this thing called My Chart. It's awesome, but I fill out a paper medical history every damn time I go someplace. And I kept saying, do you guys just read this and burn it or throw it away or shred it? I mean, how about scanning it and keeping it, but every time? So there are these weird things. I mean, we aren't anywhere near there yet. But that's where we all want to be for sure. Other questions? Well, great. Thank you all for hanging in for a long day.